Welcome to Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries. I'm Julie Cooper, a thriller writer and half of the duo bringing you this regular podcast series focused on mystery, suspense, and thriller fiction. First, our thanks to my brother Chris Squires for our theme song, The Man in the Panama Hat. And I know Wendy's anxious to talk about our theme for this episode and introduce our guest.
Hello, listeners. Today, our theme tackles truth and justice. Here's a quote. "The truth is what people believe it to be. The justice system doesn't deal in truths. It deals in evidence. The truth doesn't always leave evidence behind." Those are ominous words from the musings of fictional character, Alaskan attorney Maeve Malloy. This stoic character was created by our guest today, author Keenan Powell. Her new book, the legal thriller, Deadly Solution, will take you on an exciting and deadly tug-of-war between the justice system and those who take justice into their own hands. Here's a little bit about our guest author. Keenan Powell's first publication included illustrations in Dungeons & Dragons the summer after her high school graduation. She went on to become a criminal defense attorney, including defending murder cases. She has stories in anthologies including Mystery Most Historical, Busted, Arresting Stories from the Beat, Snowbound, and most recently, Malice Most Geographical. The first of her Maeve Malloy series is Deadly Solution, available now. The next in the series will be Hemlock Needle, and that's on the way. Keenan is also active with interesting blogs in the group Mysteristas, you've got to look for that, and in the group Sisters in Crime. Welcome, Keenan Powell.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for having me. What a pleasure and opportunity to come talk to you today.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I'm going to jump right into some questions for you, Keenan. I so appreciate your main character, Maeve Malloy, when she says to another character, "Sorry, not the huggy type." As a female protagonist, she's seen the best and worst in people, and though her soul's become a bit dog-eared, she's not cynical. Was this a conscious choice on your part when you assembled her for this book?
Yes, it was, because I wanted to deal with social issues, and I was told by some publishers and agents that they could not deal with they couldn't sell a book that focused on homeless people, which is what the first book focuses on. So I wanted to be sure that the readers understood that Maeve has an open heart and a big heart, and she cares deeply for the people that she represents, even the uncomely ones, because she has compassion for all people. And she believes, like I do, coincidentally, that all people have a certain basic dignity which needs to be acknowledged and respected.
And that definitely comes through in your writing. And here's a memorable segment from one of your character descriptions. "He understood and loved the law as only a lawyer could, and he understood shame like no one but another alcoholic would." You delineated this character beautifully with so few words. We really have an understanding of this man. Did this brevity come naturally to you, even though you're an attorney?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it does. I tend to underwrite. I did turn a brief one time. I remember that was 1 page long, and I won that particular issue because if you squander the power of what you're trying to convey if you use too many words to do it. So I've always tried to be pithy.
Which we love. Truly. Now, you mentioned this before, but much of this book's plot centers around the homeless, the poor, the vulnerable, the disabled veterans, the addicted, or the mentally ill populations. people that some would rather not see, much less acknowledge. And you did a really good job of educating your readers without preaching about the causes of homelessness in ways that are compassionate and level-headed. How much research did you do into this very important social issue?
I didn't need to do a whole lot of research because I've dealt with these populations quite a bit during my career. However, I had a hiking buddy that was a social worker, and as I developed this particular plot, I had questions about a few things. And you'll see that there's a social worker character in the book who gives us some background information, and everything she said came from my friend, the social worker.
That's great, and it really has, definitely the ring of truth to it. Now, Alaska is, I think, very much a character in your novel, and I'm guessing probably in your next novel as well. You write at one point, Alaska was a place where extreme people were normal. As someone who's been there on business, I know it's a place which is both beautiful and brutal. What do you most want our listeners in the lower 48 to know about this very special place?
After visiting the lower 48 a couple times recently, what the big distinction to me is that we are so close to nature here. Anchorage is the biggest town and in the entire state, the biggest city in the entire state, and I think at its widest part it might be 7 miles. So while I'm sitting here, I'm looking out at a mountain range on the eastern side of the Anchorage Bowl, and if I walk 10 minutes outside my door, I could see Denali from the coastal trail. There's whales out there in the summertime. There's fish out there. There's moose walking down the street. There's eagles and ravens overhead this time of year. We do stop for geese when they cross the road with their little goslings, and we certainly stop for moose because you'll destroy your car if you don't. And a lot of people here fish, or they hunt, or they camp, or they have log homes out in the wilderness, cabins that they go to, fly-in cabins. I like to hike. I like to get up in the mountains around Anchorage or in the woods just a mile from my house with the dogs, particularly in the summertime. Not right now because the bears are starting to wake up, and be in it. And so I think that Alaska is huge. We have all these natural resources, and they're very important to Alaskans, more so than I see in the lower 48, where you guys are kind of dealing with the concrete jungle.
Wow, you paint a fascinating scene. Wow.
You truly do. Keenan, I know you're going to grace us with a reading today. What are you reading for us today?
Okay, it's from Deadly Solution, and it's actually the beginning of chapter 2. It's the first time that we see the protagonist, Maeve Malloy. And it's set Tuesday, August 9th at the Nesbitt Courthouse, which is half a block from here, in Anchorage. Dressed for battle in a black suit, cream silk blouse, and black pumps, attorney Maeve Malloy deliberately angled herself at the podium to block her client's view. At the defense table sat the client's ex-husband. The young woman beside Maeve wiped her eyes with the palm of her hand. At first glance, the plaid-pleated skirt and starched white blouse made Tracy look young. But closer inspection of her drawn features, the dark circles under her eyes, and the lips pressed permanently thin made it clear that life had aged her. Ms. Malloy, you've appeared before this court many times, but for the record, please state your representation, the judge said. Maeve Artemis Malloy, for the victim, Tracy Brooks, Your Honor. Very well, we shall proceed. The judge nodded at Tracy. When you're ready, Ms. Brooks. Maeve had avoided eye contact with the defendant when she led Tracy to the podium. She had seen his kind before, people who get high from anger. Attention would only fuel his fury. Although an outburst would demonstrate his volatility, which would be particularly instructive during the sentencing, she didn't need a reputation for courtroom theatrics. At another time, though, she would have liked nothing better than to smash a man's face with a well-placed elbow. This day had been months in the making. Last winter, Maeve had stood in the circle holding hands with a small group of people as we decided the closing prayer for an meeting. When heads had lifted and hands released, the young woman with dull, colorless hair, large brown eyes, and the sharp features of the chronically underfed stood in front of her. Tracy spilled her story nonstop. Violent marriage, escape, wanted it over. In quick succession, Maeve had helped Tracy obtain a no-contact order and a divorce decree, all free. Tracy couldn't pay. Besides, this was not the kind of case she did for money. Standing now, Tracy spread scrawled notes across the podium with shaky hands. Perhaps the most important thing Maeve had done for Tracy was to stand beside her. This act alone seemed to buoy her courage, but this wasn't pure altruism on Maeve's part. After the last few disastrous months, Maeve needed to feel valuable again, to feel her work had changed someone's destiny for the better this time.
Thank you.
Great passage. That I remember reading it in the book. It's very powerful. Love it. Well, Keenan, at the beginning of Deadly Solution, you have a quote from Cicero. It's, "Not unto ourselves alone are we born." Can you talk a little about this sentiment?
Yeah, I ran across this when I was deep into revisions of Deadly Solution, and I was looking for, a pithy, meaty verbalization, articulation of exactly what I was trying to communicate in Maeve's journey in this particular book. And what Maeve's journey is in this particular book is trying to find her place in society as she's newly sober. She just left the public defender's office, and she's grown up with a grown-up career, but she's kind of emotionally and socially an infant. So that is her path in this book, and that I believe is going to be her path through the entire first 3 books, which are under contract.
Well, I just love that quote and that sentiment. That's why I wanted to ask you about it. Thanks for going over that, explaining it so beautifully. The idea that the truth doesn't always leave evidence behind in real life. Can you talk a little about how an author works or may struggle with giving the reader evidence in the story that can then bring the reader closer to the truth of what that story is?
Yeah, I found that you don't want to preach, of course. And one thing I learned in trial advocacy is that you lay the information out before the jury and hope they reach the conclusion you want them to reach. So that is what I did in this book, and what I did to the truth. I see it as a multifaceted thing, and so that when people explain their side of the story, they're looking at like a jewel. They're looking at the facets of the jewel that are in front of them, but they're not seeing maybe the table. They're not seeing the base cut. They're not seeing the other sides of the jewel. And so with creating different characters with different points of view, I was trying to show their point of view as they're all looking at this particular jewel, the issues that are going on in Deadly Solution, how these people came to be the people that they are, so that they would develop a certain kind of point of view, certain paradigm, and how they express it in their actions and words and thoughts.
Oh, that's a fascinating approach to it. I never thought about it, the similarity of writing a story with the way a lawyer lays out the story of the case. That's really interesting. Is there a place Is there a place for compassion in a legal thriller?
I would hope so. I've read a couple of other legal thrillers a few years ago, so I can't really comment on them. But because I just didn't want to write a thriller that was a long chase scene with guns and cars. I wanted to write something that appealed to people's hearts and minds. And in order to do that, you have to expose your characters' hearts and minds. So I to write the kind of story that I want to write, I think it's really important to create an atmosphere of compassion.
It really comes across the identification, the feeling that the reader, the growing feeling as I'm reading that book with the characters. I was surprised how much I could identify with those characters, several of them. So it's beautifully written.
Thank you.
The tense tug of war in your book between degrees of vigilante justice versus our established justice system was really intriguing to me. It's especially vibrant with your setting in the wilds of Alaska. Sort of like, to me, I identified that with sort of the old days of the Wild Wild West in a way. And there's times when several of your characters are tempted to delve into varying degrees of some degree of vigilante justice. Or maybe another way to put it is, for some of these characters, what they want to do is to create something that will tip justice's scales in their direction. So can you talk a little about how, as an author, you're able to create this believable tension as characters wrestle between doing what's right versus what's legally or morally wrong?
Well, thank you for that. With the characters that I created, I tried to pick characters that were each looking at different facets of this particular issue, like I talked about. And for instance, we have a man who patrols the bike trails where the homeless camps are because he wants to make it safe. And we do have patrols out there, organized patrols. And then we have a young woman who ends up homeless, even though she did everything she was supposed to do, and she's trying to be a responsible person, but she just ran out of money for various reasons. And then we have the prosecutors, and we have cops, and we have the attorneys, and we have investigators, and then we have the people who live out there, and the people who have gone through the system for other reasons and who are trying to rehabilitate themselves and get back out there, and all the people, medical professionals that deal with these folks. And so they all see it a little bit differently. They see the issues a little bit differently. In Alaska, I don't know about in the lower 48, there are some people here who, what's it, Occam's razor? They go for the simplest explanation and the simplest solution pretty quickly. And they, I think the Occam's razor just applies to the explanations, but, that's not far leap to get to the simplest solution to your issue when that is what your mindset is under your paradigm, as you're expressing the personality that you have. So that's how I tried to do that, is try to collect a set of characters that could flesh it all out. And in real life, I mean, each one of these positions, all those characters represent a position in society, in a point of view from society observed. So I spent a lot of time just reading and thinking about it and the stuff that I had read and, come across over the years in developing these characters.
Well, it's really effective when you're reading it, very effective. The truth, honesty, and credibility are tied together and are important not just in life, but also in writing for a truthful, honest, and credible fiction story. What are the parts of fiction that really have to ring true for a reader, and how does an author deliver that credibility?
What has to ring true, I believe, is that any action that a character takes is like organic development from the place that person's at, explained by their experiences, which the reader knows or is going to find out about. And it makes sense that way, that person's personality put into that particular situation, experiencing the experiences they are during the plot, is justifiable with who they are and their experiences before, so that when they go forward, what they do makes sense. May not make sense to anybody else, but it makes logical sense to them. Like you might hear this, the adage in writers' classes that everybody's a hero of their own story, even the villain.
Yes.
So that is what I try to keep in mind. I'm looking right now, reading a book called Story Genius, which really helps give you the tools for developing that organic approach.
That's one of the best books I've ever read. I love that book.
It's amazing.
It is.
I just wrote it down. Okay. Story.
I think I'll read and reread that book before every book I start.
Wow.
And I also work out of David Corbett's Art of Character, and I do all of his exercises for my main characters, and some for most of the exercises for the minor characters that are going to have a continuing appearance. Those two books together have taught me more about writing than. But I was going to say it taught me more about writing than anything else. But, I had to get to the place where I was open to this information. You got to understand the questions before you understand the answers. So there was a lot of preparation, many courses that I went to, and a lot of books I've read that got me to the place where I could appreciate these two.
Good to know. Can you talk a little about your character who's the private investigator? And I'll quote the description. Tall, sinewy, and perpetually coiled with tension. This is Tom Sinclair. It seems like he's on the front lines of the fight to collect evidence, to find evidence the killer's trying to hide, and to make sure that false evidence is not being manufactured that would give an untrue result. Can you talk a little about Tom?
Yeah, Tom. I love Tom.
I think we all do.
I'm glad. Your investigator is a guy who does the legwork, while the office, in most cases, the attorney's sitting back at the office and they brainstorm with the investigator, developing theories and look, if this is our theory, we need to find someone who can testify to XYZ. Is there anybody out there? And then he goes out and looks for them, and he comes back and tells you what he finds out and says, maybe we have to adjust our theory. So it's kind of good to have an investigator who really is familiar with the criminal element. And that is Tom, to me, someone who has kind of a mysterious criminal background, and he's really, really kind of fed up with the system. But he hangs around because Maeve's there, and he believes in Maeve. And he's seen a lot of injustice. He's seen a lot of people sold down the river by lazy or inept attorneys. And that's why he's just got one foot out, ready to quit until Maeve comes along. And he decides to quit the public defender's office when she leaves and join her firm.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I thought Tom has a very interesting relationship and history with Maeve. And it did seem to me that his loyalty was almost more to her rather than to the law or justice or even the client or anything else. Is that right? Can you talk about that relationship between him and Maeve?
Yeah, that's what I was going for. Well, he's in love with her, but he thinks he's not good enough for her because of his history. So he wants to protect her, and he is her guard dog. He wants her to do well, and so he works hard on the cases for her. And there will be cases that he believes in and cases he believes less in, but he really believes to his core that every defendant is entitled to a zealous defense, which is what Maeve believes, and that's one reason why he's so devoted to her. He just hasn't seen that happen in a lot of cases, and that's how he's become jaded.
Wow. Can you also talk a little about your character, Shelley Watson? My heart just goes out to her as someone who seems to do everything right, and yet she ends up in these dire situations.
Yeah, Shelley originally just popped up at the very end. And then when I did one of the last revisions before I submitted to the publisher, I decided that she was entitled to she needed her own arc. And right now I do workers' comp law. And day in, day out, I have clients coming through my office who did everything they were supposed to do. They went to work every day and they lifted a heavy object or they twisted the wrong way and blew out their back. And they reported the injury like they were supposed to, and their employer sends them off to a doctor, and the doctor takes them off work and gives them some treatment. Sometimes surgery is recommended, sometimes not. And at some point, an insurance doctor will come along and say, this person can go back to work. And by that time, their job's gone. Yeah. But their treating physician doesn't say the person could go back to work, and that's why there's a case. And then we get into litigating the issue. So many of my clients show up here homeless. If they have a home at all, it's because they have a spouse or they have family that is taking care of them, supporting them. But I have had people who were in the shelters because they lost their jobs, and unjustly we're cut off from workers' comp unjustly. And it can take a year and a half to straighten this out. And meanwhile, there's no resources available to them. And so, that's something I feel passionately about. So I decided to work that in and show that I don't want people thinking that the entire homeless population or the people who are bordering on homeless are all derelicts. There are hardworking people out there who just didn't get a fair shake.
That's such an important message. I really appreciated it in the book. At one point, the defendant, Ollie, says to Maeve, "You don't believe in me. A lawyer is supposed to believe in their client." In your thriller, Deadly Solution, we see this tension throughout, where the truth actually isn't what people believe, and how this affects the relationship between characters. And in this case, with this quote, it's the relationship between client and lawyer. Can you talk a little about Maeve's feelings about this?
She's frustrated. She's not the husband type. She's not someone who naturally gushes emotional support for someone. And but it's understandable when you go into jail, this guy's been sitting there in a cell, or the only society has are other criminals probably waiting to go to trial. They're all working on their cases. They're all waiting for somebody to show up. So when somebody shows up who's supposed to be on their side, they have an emotional need for validation. And that's not the attorney's job. The attorney's job is to evaluate the evidence with a cold eye and explain to them the downsides of their case and where they could possibly lose the case. They might want to think about taking a plea deal. You can also plead straight up to a case and throw yourself on the mercy of a court, go to trial, or spend some time talking to them and see if there's other evidence out there that they didn't think was important that might be important, so you need to follow up on. And so it can be kind of frustrating when she's trying to offer him something that he doesn't really appreciate. He wants something from her that she can't give him. So there's tension there.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's just an amazing book. Highly recommend it. Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you because I think you've got a segment sort of on the similar topics as Keenan's book.
I do. Wendy's introduction about the subject of truth and justice got me thinking. It's easy to raise my blood pressure these days just by turning on the news. We have a number of elected officials who seem to view truth as a relative thing, something that can be shaped by money and manipulation. Sadly, they see situational ethics as a standard operating procedure, especially in politics and even business. So it's comforting from a reader's perspective to dip into a legal thriller or mystery where at some point evil will be found and punished and the truth will be vindicated. Real life is not so orderly and the outcome is often not what we would wish for. Maybe that explains the lasting draw of the legal mystery genre for so many of us. It's our version of a morality play where we're assured a front row seat for the perp walk. And I did a little research on some of the top legal mysteries and thrillers, past and present, many recommended by the American Bar Association's journal, among other sources. How many of these have you read? Presumed Innocent by Scott Turow. And yes, he did write most of this book on a commuter train going back and forth to work. And this book set the tone for many of the legal thrillers to follow. Affirm and A Time to Kill by John Grisham. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, true crime. Anatomy of a Murder by Robert Traver. Published in 1958, it also became an excellent film by Otto Preminger. Defending Jacob by William Landay. Any Book by Philip Margolin. The Lincoln Lawyer and the Brass Verdict by Michael Connelly. The General's Daughter by Nelson DeMille. And you knew I had to have at least one military mystery in here, right?
Yeah, right.
And here's another one, The Caine Mutiny by Herman Wouk. And then there's QB7, that actually stands for Queen's Bench 7 by Leon Uris, an excellent novel based on a real-life libel case in post-Nazi Europe. Primal Fear by William Deal. Prior Bad Acts by Tammy Hoag. And last but not least, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. It's really more of a meditation on truth than a legal mystery. I'm recalling the quote from Atticus Finch. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. There's a lot of great reading on this list, and I hope you get the chance to dip into some of these recommendations, along with Keenan Powell's contemporary legal mysteries. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Julie. Well, as I was thinking about the theme today, I sort of ended up focusing on the jury. So I was looking at the juror's oath or affirmation that they take. And with there's some small variations in different places, but essentially the juror's oath is, I swear that I will give a true verdict according to the evidence. Some jurors write books about their experiences on their cases. Surprisingly, these books rarely lead to overall analysis and debate about the system, the gravity, and the challenges of this everyday experience and responsibility that ordinary citizens shoulder. I want to encourage people to study real-life cases, the evidence, laws, and arguments presented to juries in a way to also understand our justice system. I really appreciated an article by Keith Wagstaff. You can find it at theweek.com, who highlighted information from 5 books that may interest you about the jury experience. They're authored by people who lived the experience on high exposure cases. One of the 6 jurors on the George Zimmerman trial is currently writing about how the panel had no option but to find Zimmerman not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter in the shooting death of unarmed teenager Trayvon Martin. This juror is currently writing her memoir. Could it impact and further the national conversation about race, gun control, or other issues? Hung Jury, The Diary of a Menendez Juror by Hazel Thornton is about the 1993 trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez, who were sentenced to life in prison for shooting their wealthy parents with shotguns in their Beverly Hills mansion. This was within the first few years of the era of court TV. It's described, the book, as riveting emotional testimonies, the deluge of minutia, and the unpleasant graphic evidence, and that may be why sales were not good for this book, although the jury experience is so interesting. Private Diary of an OJ Juror by Michael Knox is a courtroom confessional written with the help of National Enquirer columnist Mike Walker. It was released before the trial was over, since the author was dismissed early for lying about his own criminal record. Madam Foreman, A Rush to Judgment. This is by Amanda Cooley, Carrie Bess, and Marsha Rubin Jackson. It was panned by critics, It discusses an interesting dimension for juries, particularly in this case, and that is the interpretation of reasonable doubt. They write that this was interpreted as any doubt whatsoever. It also discusses the impact of jury consultants in deciding who will be on a jury. And finally, We the Jury, Deciding the Scott Peterson Case by Greg Baratlis, Tom Marino, and 5 others. Yes, 7 jurors collaborated on this book. This book is about the trial of Scott Peterson on death row after conviction for killing his wife, Lacey Peterson. Their unborn son, Connor, was also killed. A fascinating dimension here is the examination of the lasting, sad effects on the jurors for what they heard during the trial. So consider reading some of or all of these books and what you can learn from those who've gone before us on juries. And now, in addition to our guest's phenomenal book, I have 2 reference books that I wanted to recommend. The Writer's Complete Crime Reference Book by Martin Roth, and also the Crime Writer's Reference Guide, 1001 Tips for Writing the Perfect Murder by the same author. For writers, these are great books, but these are also interesting for mystery reader enthusiasts. With all this talk about the importance of evidence, my recommendation is for these 2 books that focus on translating real evidence and factual information about crime solving into fiction. It's all the information you need to commit and solve the perfect fictional crime. So many questions you may have about law enforcement and crime are answered in these books. The author clearly understands how writers work and the challenges of integrating facts into fiction. These are guides for writers that provide facts and excellent sources, resource lists, and suggestive readings for nearly every aspect of crime. The books also cover aspects of plotting literary crime. So when stuck for an idea, a subject, a character, a plot direction, try these to ignite a spark to get writing again. Getting the details wrong is the most common error in crime writing, and don't think that you can get away with dramatic license excuses, because today's readers are sharp and will pick up on poorly researched writing. Here's a couple of examples that you can think about. Do you know what's the difference between ballistics and firearm identification? Do you know the difference between criminologists and criminalists? The author, Martin Roth, was a professional writer over 40 years with a 20-year focus strictly on crime writing. He wrote television scripts for shows like Hawaii Five-0, Heart to Heart, Vegas, Mannix, and lots more. These books are from the author's own research and experience in the field. And here's a fun trivia fact that's totally unrelated to crime, but the earliest citation from September 1979 for introducing the word karaoke to the English-speaking world was from Martin Roth's writing. Now I'm wondering what Keenan would recommend to our listeners.
Well, I tell you what, when Martin Edwards, who is an attorney actually in England, and he's also currently the president of the Detective Club, that club that Agatha Christie started with her friends
yes.
back in the day, and it's active, where they do the swearing in on top of a skull, or a real human skull. Anyway, Martin Edwards, he finally comes to Malice Domestic, the convention, and I've met him, and he wrote a book called The Golden Age of Murder that I think won all the awards. I think was nominated for all the awards and took most of them, the Agatha, the Edgar, the Anthony. And I read it, and it's about the development of the club and the people in it and the inspiration for the writing. And we don't understand it now. We look at a lot of those and we think, well, those are cute little stories. But at the time, a lot of them were commentaries on notorious cases that were going on that everybody knew about, they read about in the newspapers. So I am starting to turn more and pay attention more to current crimes. And one particularly interesting one is documented in a podcast that I picked up on Audible for free. It was for free when I got it. I don't know if they're charging now. And it's called West Cork. And it's a true crime story. About 25 years ago, there was a French filmmaker who bought a holiday home in West Cork, Ireland, and she was there for Christmas, her Christmas holiday, and she was staying by herself, and she was found murdered in the road in front of her house and beaten to death. A really violent, passionate crime. And there is a prime suspect, and he is one of the who was never charged, although he's about to be tried in absentia in France, because under their law they can do that, but he's never charged in Ireland. And Wild Cork was written and investigated and developed and recorded by these two British journalists who did a brilliant job of developing the story in a way that's really interesting, other than just going from the crime to the legal proceedings, and bringing out what went wrong with the case, which started with a totally botched police investigation. And because the police investigation was so bad, the prosecutor refused to file charges on it. And there were a couple other civil cases developed after that kept developing the evidence. And so I recommend it highly to people who are not legal professionals, because they can hear the actual voice of a suspect explaining why he's not guilty, and explaining all the evidence that comes up and why that is not evidence of guilt. You're not going to get that opportunity outside of a jail cell. Interviewing someone who's accused. So it's a great book or a great podcast, and it's really well done.
Awesome.
That sounds fascinating. Well, I'm taking a different tack here today. I'm recommending a thriller by writer Chris Pavone called The Expats. And it's a taut novel of international suspense, and was both an Anthony Award winner and an Edgar Award winner for Best First Novel. The author starts us off with a question: can we ever escape our secrets? It's an especially appropriate topic for the female protagonist, Kate Moore, since she's just recently resigned from the CIA and is focused on her family and living as an expat in European capitals. Her husband is a cybersecurity consultant for international banks, an expert on hacking financial targets. Her quiet days in Luxembourg are filled with her son's play dates, coffee get-togethers, weekends in Paris, and living the good life as an expatriate. But there's a secret from her past that threatens to unravel her life, and suddenly there are new suspicions about another American couple, a pair who may be too friendly and may not be what they seem to be. Publishers Weekly called it meticulously plotted, psychologically complex, but it's Pavone's portrayal of Kate and her quest to find meaning in her charade of an existence that makes this book such a powerful read. It has lots of suspense that builds gradually without resorting to the obligatory car chases, and features some surprising double crosses. Chris, the author, was a book editor for nearly 2 decades, so you've got to believe the man really knows how to turn the screws and assemble an intricate plot that will keep you guessing. It's highly recommended, but be aware that this book is 498 pages, which is truly an amazing achievement for a thriller when most in this genre end at about 350 pages, tops. So in closing, our special thanks to legal mystery writer Keenan Powell for our interview today. Thank you, Keenan, for your insights on truth, justice, and writing suspense. We're so glad you could join us. Keep reading and keep writing.